Good evening, everyone. We continue our study in the book of First Kings. Today, we continue with chapter 14, and it's a brand new narrative that continues from chapter 13. And it says, at that time, Aviah, this is the name here, Aviah, the son of Jeroboam, became sick. Um, I think we need to be aware that the Hebrew meaning for sick literally becomes weak. It basically it describes the person's condition rather than define what is actually happening. He actually becomes weak. He becomes sick. He becomes ill for some reason, right? It could be because of the body, because of sickness, because of diseases, because being afflicted, but basically describing the condition of the child. So the son of Jeroboam is in particular this name Aviah. And so Jeroboam said to the wife, this is, and then after the son is taken ill, Jeroboam said to the wife, he says, now go and disguise yourself so they will not know who you are, the wife of Jeroboam, and go to Shiloh. Now, Shiloh, it's below Bethel, but in between Bethel and Jerusalem. And it says, behold, Ahijah, the prophet is there, who said regarding me that I will be king over this people. Now, these words are in italics. It means that it's not there, but basically it is about Ahijah who spoke about me to be king, right? Regarding me to be king over this people. This is in First Kings 11. So remember, this is the prophecy where Ahijah caught hold of Jeroboam's garment, tore it into 12 pieces, put into his hands 10 pieces. So Jeroboam now remembers Ahijah. And he says to the wife, take 10 loaves with you, some pastry, some biscuits, and a flask of honey. Then go to him, and he will tell you what will happen to the child. Now, here it is about Jeroboam remembering the man of God. Because what Ahijah said about Jeroboam came to pass, he actually became king of Israel. He now realizes that all this is done because of God. However, it was only at this point in time when he is unable to handle the son's illness that he remembers Ahijah, which is a shame. Because when he was in good terms, in good times, he did all the things that were against God. He invented feasts, he recruited priests, he built altars, he introduced two golden calves or bull calves. In verse 4, Jeroboam's wife, and then after Jeroboam talked to the wife then set out and went to Shiloh, came to the house of Ahijah. Now, Ahijah could not see because his eyes were glossy from his old age. This idea here in verse 4 basically says this. Um, he could not see because his eyes were, it says here, glossy, still. Uh, I think I think this word would be still. That he is not moving his eyes anymore. He can't see, right? Uh, And it's all because of old age. So in advanced age, maybe he had cataract, maybe whatever else he may have, but this is about blindness. Clearly, he couldn't see because his eyes were still, not really glossy, but still. Now, in verse 5, we read about the man of God, Ahijah, and we read about God himself, Jehovah, spoke to Ahijah. And he says, behold, the wife of Jeroboam is coming to ask you. This word inquire means to ask. Ask of you about her son because he is sick. You shall say such and such to her, for it will be when she arrives that she is going to make herself unrecognizable. This word unrecognizable literally means disguised. This is in verse 5. Unrecognizable, uh, calls herself, how should we say? Calls herself, uh, calls herself, uh, calls herself to be regarded, calls herself to be discerned. And basically, she doesn't want Ahijah to know. So how would Ahijah know? Because God told him so. This is important because this is how a man of God is used by God in such circumstances. Verse 6. So when Ahijah heard the sound of her feet coming in the doorway, so means and then, he said to her, come in, wife of Jeroboam. Why do you make yourself unrecognizable? Or why do you do this uh, to be regarded, to be noticed as somebody else? I think that would be a way of saying it. Nevertheless, I am sent to you a harsh word. And this is important. Something that is hard. The word harsh here would be something difficult. This is what it means. Something difficult, something severe, something grievous, something that is not good, no, something that is troubling. All these are good words, and that's what it means by a harsh message. I am sent to you. I'm here to send you a harsh message. The message is very difficult for Jeroboam's wife to handle. He says, go say to Jeroboam, this is what the Lord, the God of Israel says. This is important. And the reason why it's important because it defines who the speaker is. The message is from Jehovah, the same God who says that Jeroboam is going to be king of Israel. And so he is now God of Israel. I made you king of Israel. I am the God of Israel. Because I exalted you from among the people and made you leader over my people Israel. This word leader literally means chief. That's a king, right? King is chief. And God says, I tore apart the kingdom away from the house of David and I gave it to you. Now, This is the idea. The kingdom of Solomon had 12 tribes, and it was torn apart. 10 of it went to Jeroboam. That is Israel, and that's the north. And God says, I gave you this kingdom, but I retain two to Rehoboam, because that was a promise to David. And this would be Judah by tribe, and this is the south. Now, we will keep revisiting this so that you understand that this is what God wanted to do after Solomon. He says, I gave it to you. God gave it to Jeroboam, yet you have not been like my servant David. What did David do? He kept my commandments, followed me with all his heart, to do only that which is right in my sight. This is man after or following behind after God's heart. And God's heart means God's will. What God wants to do, David did that. And so now when God compared Jeroboam to David, Jeroboam is not there. I gave this to you and I gave you the conditions. God's land, God's rules. And then this is what God had observed. You have done more evil than all who were before you, and you have gone and made for yourself other gods. This would be the golden calves, cast metal images to provoke me to anger, and have thrown me behind your back. This word literally means ignored God. That's what it means, throw behind your back. And to disregard God, right? Disregard. So he was doing what he wants to do. Verse 10, therefore, for this reason, I am bringing disaster. Now, this word disaster is this word here, ra'ah. And it literally means evil on the house of Jeroboam, and I will eliminate. The word eliminate here is to cut off. Karat, to cut off. That would mean to bring to nothing. Every male child, both born and free in Israel, the northern kingdom, and I will make a clean sweep of the house of Jeroboam. A clean sweep here literally means burn of the house of Jeroboam, just as one. No, this word sweep is not sweep. This word sweep is to burn, right? You don't sweep excrement, you burn excrement. And so the idea here is it is to expunge. And so God says this is evil in the eyes of Jeroboam. In God's eyes is good because he is taking a judgment on the house of Jeroboam. But in the eyes of Jeroboam, this is evil. And so God says, I am going to do this until there is no more. So this is the idea, until no more. Until there is nothing left of Jeroboam's house. And it says here, anyone belonging to Jeroboam who dies in the city, the dogs will eat. This will be I would say it is in a way a shame, no dignity for the dead. The dogs will eat. Anyone who dies in the field, the birds of the sky will eat. For the Lord has spoken it. This is the judgment for anyone belonging to Jeroboam who dies. Now, in verse 12, it says this. Now you, that's the wife of Jeroboam, rise and go to your house. When your feet enter the city, the child will die. This is a prophecy. The child dies. Jeroboam asked the wife to ask Ahijah what's going to happen to the child, and now he gets the answer. The child dies. Verse 13. After the child dies, all Israel, this is the northern kingdom, they will mourn for him and bury him. Now, in verse 13, it says, mourn here literally means to wail, to cry. And this is good because this brings dignity to the child. He's buried. The others will be eaten by animals. Right? That's basically what it says. For he alone of Jeroboam's family will come to the grave. Now, this word grave here means a tomb. The only one who will be buried. So he alone will be buried because in him something good was found toward the Lord God of Israel in the house of Jeroboam. Now, Jewish tradition had various things to say, but for our sakes today, we just need to know that something good was found toward the God of Israel. So good is seen in the eyes of God. Evil will come to Jeroboam because evil is in his eyes. But in the eyes of God, this child will have dignity when he dies. Now in verse 14, it says, moreover, the Lord will raise up for himself. You see, the Lord will raise up for himself tells us that kings are from God. But we'll find, like in Saul, God chose, the people chose. So God actually appoints them who is going to be king over Israel and who will eliminate the house of Jeroboam this day and from now on. This day means children now, and this is be children then, future. This is what it means by expunge, to cut off. And understand this. God told Jeroboam in 1 Kings chapter 11, if he follows what God says and he is loyal to God, then his dynasty will perpetuate. But in this case, his dynasty will end. It will expunge. It will be cut off. And it will be eliminated from the house of Jeroboam. This is the promise of God. As sure as Jeroboam became king, well, it will be sure that Jeroboam's descendants will come to an end sometime. In verse 15, God then says these things. These are all prophecies. He says, for the Lord will strike Israel. Now, notice Israel is the northern kingdom. It says, the Lord will strike, and by striking, will bring a scourge over Israel. Just as a reed sways in the water, it causes all kinds of turbulence, meaning all kinds of problems. And that's the first one. And then he will uproot Israel from this good land which he gave to their fathers. And the idea of uproot means to pluck out. Uproot here literally means to pluck out. And this is an active word. You see, God uses the reed and sways it in the water. The idea of swaying means it will move to and fro. And so the water will be troubled. And then God says he will uproot Israel. And so if you think of Israel as a tree with the roots, it will be uprooted from the land. So it won't be in the land of Israel. And where will it be? God says he will scatter them beyond the river. Now understand that this word Euphrates is not in the Hebrew. It says that he will be rooted out from the ground. And this is the Adamah, from this good land that he gave to the father. And then he will scatter. The idea of scatter is to cast away. Right? To cast away. It's like winnowing. Is to disperse. Disperse them beyond the Euphrates River, because they have made their Asherim, provoking the Lord God to anger. Now, this word Asherim is plural for idol worship, using trees. And provoking God to anger, this word here isn't just the normal sense of wrath, but this one really makes God grieved, vexed. These are words used. He's sorrowful. All these are good words. That when God sees Israel doing this, he is really upset. He's very sad. He is all of these adjectives put together. In verse 16, he says he will give up Israel. Now, this word give up Israel literally surrenders, give away. Because of the sins of Jeroboam, which he committed, with which he misled Israel into sin. Now, this idea of misled, you find that in the Hebrew, it says, which because of the sins of Jeroboam, which he sinned, with which he caused Israel to sin. I think this would be a better way of expressing. And in Hebrew, it is okay to use the same word all the time so that you know what is being said. Now, in English, it's not good English style to keep using the same word. So you find that the translator uses the word sins, but doesn't want to keep using the word sin, so he used the word committed from a verb, which he misled Israel in to sin. And that is actually the same idea of sinning. Now, think of it like this way. The idea of sin is khata. That would be khata. And to sin as a verb is also khata. All right. Basically, it's to miss. Miss means this: you have a target, you shoot at the target, and then it hits somewhere else. And so this is missed. Now, how do you miss? Do you miss it intentionally? No, you miss it unintentionally. And so the description here, we need to be more clear. God says he will surrender and give up Israel because of the sins of Jeroboam. What are the sins of Jeroboam? He went in to invent feasts, priests, and gods so that they don't go down to Jerusalem. And this is the sin. He missed God. He brought in something else. And he caused Israel to do the same, to serve other gods without realizing that that's wrong too. That's how verse 16 is describing. And God pins it on one person, Jeroboam. And God expects him to bear the consequences, but because he is the king of Israel, then the people will suffer. And so all of this in verse 15 is a description of one day God will cause them to be taken away, and that would be the Assyrian conquest. That will be correct. Verse 17, then is and then. Now, after hearing all these things, I'm sure that she would have been shocked. Jeroboam's wife stood up and left and came to Tirzah. The idea of Tirzah is where they were staying. As she was entering the threshold of the house, the child died. And so, what do you find here? Prophecy fulfilled. Basically, the child dying is an act of God, right? I would say it is an act of God because God had decided, and the child would not be judged for dying because the child was sick, and so the child died. So the timing of the death was in the hands of God, just like the child of David when he was judged and the child died. And in this case, also the child died. Verse 18. If you recall what was said earlier on, this child would be remembered and would be dignifiedly buried. And then all Israel buried him and mourned for him in accordance with the word of the Lord, which he had spoken through his servant Ahijah the prophet. This is very clear that you find this in verse 13. This is prophecy fulfilled. Verse 13. Just 5 verses ago that was said, and it now happened. So this is the way to really recognize the true prophet. In verse 19, it says, and for the rest of the acts of Jeroboam, whatever Jeroboam did, how he made war, and in this case, he was fighting with Rehoboam, how he reigned. Behold, they are written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel. This book itself is no longer around. And so the text does express that there is a specific book, the book of Chronicles, regarding the kings of Israel, and much of it is written there. Now, this is not the book of Chronicles that was compiled by Ezra after the exile. This, in actual fact, is besides the book of Kings, there is also the book of Chronicles that describes what each of the kings had done. And this book is no longer. In verse 20, it says, and the time that Jeroboam reigned was 22 years. And he lay down with his fathers. And this expression, lay down with his fathers, or slept with his fathers. So this word, lay down or slept with his fathers, is buried in the same family tomb. So that's Jeroboam. Now his son, Nadav, reigned in his place. Now we had read about the fact that the entire dynasty of Jeroboam is going to be cut off. And so let me explain to you this word cut off. Cut off is a process. It is not immediate, but it will come to an end. This is what karat actually means, to cut off. And so what we find is that Nadav only reigned for 2 years. And somebody else took over, and it wasn't from the descendants of Jeroboam. And by that time, then the prophecy that the house of Jeroboam will be cut off will be complete. Now we look at verse 21, back to the life of Rehoboam, right? Rehoboam. Now Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, reigned in Judah. Remember, 10 tribes to Jeroboam, 2 to Rehoboam. Rehoboam was 41 years old when he became king, and he reigned for 17 years in Jerusalem, the city which the Lord had chosen from all the tribes of Israel to put his name there. And his mother's name was Naamah the Ammonitess. This was put in there probably to recognize her as someone loyal to God. But more importantly is we would find that Rehoboam was 41 years old and reigned for 17 years in Jerusalem. This was the time where Solomon became king, 40 years. And Rehoboam was 41 years old, which means that 1 year before Solomon, Rehoboam was born. And so Rehoboam reigned for 17 years. That's all it means. And these were all in Jerusalem. Now, again, when you read words like these, that it was in Jerusalem, it is to remind us how important the city was. That it was chosen by God. So when God chooses something, it is important. It is not a flimsy or whimsical thing. It is for all the tribes of Israel to put his name there so that all 12 tribes will come to Jerusalem 3 times a year. But Jeroboam had other ideas. Now we read of what Jeroboam did, right? He invented feasts so that the people had a time to celebrate, but these are not the feasts of God. He picked 2 places, Bethel and Dan. He made 2 idols, bull calves made of gold, and told them that this was the God that brought them out of Egypt. And he had priests who weren't from the Levi. He created a whole new order. He made himself priest as well. He created a whole new religion, if you want to put it that way. And it was only because he didn't want them to go to the city of Jerusalem. And it's a pity. He missed the point. He missed the importance of Jerusalem. He tried to avert the people from going, and in so doing, he was against God. Now, our narrative comes to Rehoboam in the south. The north had done all kinds of things against God blatantly. But the people of Judah did evil in the sight of the Lord. Now, I want to point out to you, good and evil is always in the eyes of the beholder. When trouble comes to the house of Jeroboam, it would be evil in the eyes of Jeroboam. And when Judah did evil in the eyes of the Lord, it is because God looks at it and it's not right to God. And says that they provoked him to jealousy with their sins, which they sinned, right? They sinned more than all their fathers had done, right? They had sinned more than their fathers had sinned. So you can see the word sin is used multiple times just to enlighten us that this word provoke to jealousy with their sins is very serious. Provoke him to sin is actually an intense action. Made God very jealous. Now, why is God jealous? If you recall in the 10 Commandments, God says, do not serve idols. Do not make anything into idols. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. I am a jealous God. See, I am a jealous God. And this is in the book of Exodus, chapter 20, in the 10 Commandments. And so, what are their sins? Right here, idolatry. And so, the northern kingdom had sins of idolatry, the southern kingdom had sins of idolatry. Verse 23, for they too, who is they? Judah, had built for themselves high places. That's Bamot. These are altars at the hilltops. And it says here, memorial stones. Memorial stones would be monuments or pillars, right? Pillars or stumps. Memorials are made of stones. And then it says here, there is the Asherim. The Asherim are trees. On every high hill and under every luxuriant tree, every green tree, every tree that is, how should we say, growing growing lush and well. They made it into a god. And so these are idolatry. And so it made God jealous. And when it made God jealous, what does Exodus 20 says? That God will visit them in the third and fourth generation. And this is the time it all began. There were also male cult prostitutes. This would be in the form of adultery. It is called adultery in the land. Now, this idea of temple prostitute are people who committed themselves to licentiousness for the sake of the religion. And these are idolatry religions. They committed all the same abominations of the nations which the Lord dispossessed before the sons of Israel. What are abominations? We read in the book of Exodus, abominations are things that disgust God, right? And what are these things? These are idols. Idols. And it's called abomination in the English. Verse 25. And now it happened in the 5th year of the king of Rehoboam. Remember, he reigned for 17 years, right? 17-year reign. In the early first portion of his reign, first third, King Shishak, the king of Egypt, marched against Jerusalem. King Shishak came against Jerusalem. And remember, King Shishak was also the king that took care of Jeroboam. And we find that in 1 Kings 11. And Shishak is a friend of Jeroboam when he went into exile in Egypt. And so now you can see that this encounter is because of King Shishak, being a friend of Jeroboam, had come to disturb Rehoboam. He took away the treasures of the house of the Lord. What are the treasures of the house of the Lord? Things in the temple. Things in the temple. And then treasures of the king's house. This would be the palace. And he took everything. He took all the shields of gold which Solomon had made. And it says when he took everything, this, according to Jewish tradition, included Solomon's throne. Now, all these are to tell us that Shishak was very successful in this escapade in Jerusalem. So King Rehoboam made shields of bronze in their place. What happened was that these were shields of gold that were taken away. Now they made shields of bronze. Shields of gold represents the protection of God. Shields of bronze is a replacement. And he entrusted it to the care of the commanders of the guard who guarded the doorway to the king's house. And so he moved this, the shields of gold, to shields of bronze, is to protect himself. And thereby we begin to see the slide of King Rehoboam. 28. And it happened as often as the king entered the house of the Lord, that's the temple, the guards would carry them. This is the shields of bronze, and would bring them back to the guard's room in the palace. We come to the end of this chapter, verse 29. And for the rest of the acts of Rehoboam and all that he did, were they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah? Again, this is not the book of Chronicles in the Bible. It is a lost annals. And this is on the kings of Judah. Just now for Jeroboam, it would be the kings of Israel. This is the south, and Jeroboam was the north. And we are told, and there was a war between Rehoboam and Jeroboam continually. Now remember, Rehoboam wanted to attack Jeroboam earlier, but he was told that don't do that because it is what God has wanted, to rip the kingdom apart. And so Rehoboam stayed back. But now war continuously happened. And the idea of a war here, battles, I guess you can call this the civil war. This is south. This is north. And the tribes are continually fighting. And so we find that there is a lot of animosity. And after Shishak came to disturb Rehoboam, that was when all plans of not attacking Jeroboam the north was thrown out of the window. While God had wanted him not to attack Jeroboam, now that King Shishak had come in, well, that's going to happen. And Rehoboam decided to go to war with Rehoboam. That's how it is. So remember, Rehoboam was 17 years, and Jeroboam was 22 years. Right? We have 17 years, and then we had 22 years. And after the fifth year, where Shishak came, then we find that this period of time was continually in war. And this is how we would read this war. The civil war continued. And Rehoboam lay down or slept with his fathers and was buried with his fathers in the city of David. And his mother's name was Naamah the Ammonitess. Again, must be something good about Naamah. And his son Abijam became king in his place. And this is Abijam right here. And so now we have Solomon. And then we have Rehoboam. And then we have Abijam. We had Jeroboam. And then we had Nadav, who took over for a very short period, because the next chapter we will see that he dies. And so we end here in chapter 14, seeing how things had transpired and what took place, how Jeroboam fell into judgment of God, and how his entire dynasty was going to come to an end. his son died, and all his children will eventually die. And it would not be his own descendants that will become king of Israel, and there will be a new king from a new tribe as king of Israel. Whereas for Judah, Rehoboam dies, and Abijam, his son, took over to be king, and it will continue all the way down because God promised David that his throne will continue for Olam. And with this, we come to the end of chapter 14 today. How can inventing feasts, priests, and gods be considered as unintentional sin, and what is intentional sin? Very, very good question. Let me explain a little bit. Khata is what we call unintentional as a description. And then Avon and Pesha is intentional. And so let me just explain what is intentional. Intentional would cover things like rebellion, things like blasphemy, things that is like Hamas, that is violence, that is injustice. These are considered Avon and Pesha, where they would twist the justice system to suit the rich and the powerful. And we call that intentional because they are seen in the Bible as things that will defy God in the face, right? Defy God in the face. Khata, on the other hand, although these are the sins that Jeroboam had done, and in our mind sounds very grievous because it seems to be in the face of God. But it is seen as khata because they missed the part. They missed the point about worshiping God. They missed the point about who God is. They are still trying to worship God, but they are replacing Jehovah God with something else like the bull calves made of gold. And it is called unintentional or khata in that sense. I use the word English in English, unintentional, but the idea is about missing the point. They missed the point about worshiping God. So they thought that, well, instead of going to Jerusalem, we'll make another set of gods and we have our own little place where the people are still worshiping God, and that's missing the point. So I think that is as simple as I think I can make it, but it's all from a Hebrew viewpoint. And so we need to look at khata, sin, from a Hebrew viewpoint, Avon and Pesha, also from a Hebrew viewpoint, because they are described in a micro view, not a macro view. And so intentional is really into the face of God, defying God. And that becomes what we call intentional sins. Now, all are equally bad, and there are different levels and degree of judgment and punishment by God. And the ones that is intentional has the highest degree, and unintentional, in many cases, are not very grievous. For example, when in Leviticus chapters 1 to 7, when a person becomes unclean because of discharge, bodily discharge, because of touching a dead person, the person becomes unclean and to sacrifice, and they have to seek atonement and to be cleansed. Now, in this particular case of Jeroboam, it is also seen as a khata or described as a khata, but in a more serious form of it, because idolatry has no atonement. And Leviticus 1 to 7 describes what can be atoned and what cannot. And so there are these idolatry kind of activities that has no atonement and requires them to repent. Else God will visit them in the third and fourth generation. So don't think of unintentional as something that is trivial, or intentional as something trivial. The punishment of unintentional sins can still be very severe. Death of a child, absolutely. So it is God who will judge, and God will pronounce a kind of punishment that befits the sins. And this is what we are seeing here in chapter 14, that God is the judge. God will decide. How God will punish, God has his ways. And so this punishment may be the death of a child, but in later years, when Israel continues this path of idolatry, they will be taken away and scattered beyond the Euphrates River. And so, yes, you're right. But the point that I'm trying to make is God judges, and God judges justly. And so we read in chapter 14.